Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus says, the truly human being is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew up from the sea full of little fish. Among them, the wise fisherman discovered a fine large fish. He threw all the little fish back in the ocean and chose the large fish. Anyone here with 2 good ears had better listen. Jesus says, look, the sower went out, took a handful of seed and scattered them. Some fell on the road, and the birds came and gathered them. Others fell on rock, and they didn't take root in the soil and didn't produce heads of grain. Others fell on thorns, and they choked the seeds, and the worms ate them. And others fell on good soil, and it produced a good crop. It yielded 60 per measure and 120 per measure. Jesus says, I have come to cast fire upon the world, and look, I am guarding it until it blazes. Jesus says, this heavens will pass away, and the one above this heavens will pass away. The dead are not alive, and the living will die. During the days when you ate what is dead, you made it come alive. When you were in the light, what then will you be able to do? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you become two, then what will you do? Jesus says, I give you what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no hand has touched, and what has not arisen in the human heart, and what has never occurred to the human mind. The gospel inspired by God. Namaste, my sisters and brothers. Last Sunday, I came up with a jawbreaker that I want to explain a little bit today. I was talking about my belief system that God is not a creator, and I'm borrowing this from Plotinus, who lived 1900 years before me almost. And my belief system was this, that only God is real, only God exists. And the essence of God is not to create that which is other to her. The essence of God is just to flow and to emanate. And this emanation, it seems to me, I suggested last Sunday, goes through a process of what I would call densification. As it emanates further and further from the source, it becomes denser and denser and denser. And so the first emanation from source you might call consciousness. And consciousness is very subtle. It has very little density. But at some stage, it leads to intentionality. And finally, intentionality results in manifestation. And everything we see around us and feel around us is manifestation from source via intentionality that comes from consciousness. But there are levels of density for all of this. God herself has absolutely no density. It's the most causal and subtle of all. But from this comes consciousness, which is a little bit dense, and from that comes intentionality, which is a little bit more dense. And then when you get into manifestation, there are degrees of density. For instance, matter is the most dense of all. And when you look at matter, there are different states of matter that are more or less dense. Steam is very, very subtle form of density. Solid matter is more dense. If you want to go to the very extreme, the densest thing in our universe is a black hole in space. Now, if we think that the denser something it is, the more real it is, then the biggest reality in our universe is a black hole in space, and the least real thing is God, our source. But we have it upside down. The more dense it is, the less real it is. And so that which is tangible is far less real than that which is intangible. And so matter is far denser and therefore less real than soul is real. And words are denser and therefore less real than thoughts are. And so if we're going to use words in order to speak about subtle things like God, we have to choose our words very, very carefully and very, very subtly. And the words that cannot tell us anything about God are the words of science and philosophy and theology. They really cannot tell us about God. And so you hear in all the mystical traditions, those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. But if we are forced to speak about God or about source, then we have to choose our words really, really carefully. We have to choose the most subtle forms of words, the least dense kinds of words. And Jesus was a master at this. And so we find in this third reading today, he's using words in their absolutely subtlest form. And the subtlest form of words always are parables, allegory, metaphor. They never come in scientific parlance or in theological jargon or philosophical terminology. You can't capture God in any of those modalities. And so here is Jesus talking today about the levels of this language and the ways in which we unpack it. So even when you use words really, really subtly, going as near to God as you can, every one of us who hears the words, we can only unpack it at the level we have reached in our own spiritual evolution. And Jesus is saying precisely this. He says, look, what is it like? The truly human person. And when he uses this phrase, the truly human person, he really means the enlightened being, the one who is awake, the Buddha figure, the Christ-conscious individual. That's what he's talking about. He's saying the truly human person realizes that when a sower goes out to seed, to scatter his seed, some is going to fall on the road and the birds will come and take it away. In other words, there are people who hear the word of God, even in a subtle form, and it passes right over their head. They don't get it. And then he says there's some falls on rocky soil, and initially it begins to try to thrive, but it has no depth of soil and it withers. There are people who understand the spiritual message at a little level and they're excited for a while, but then they really don't get it and they give up. And then there are people who hear the word, it falls among thorns, but the thorns choke it off and the worms finally get to eat it. And there are people, again, who get involved and excited for a while, but when tribulation comes, they abandon the search and they give up. And he says, then there are some people, they're like the soil, the good soil, and the word of God falls there. And then, depending again on the level of our evolution, we'll produce either 60-fold, or 100-fold, or 120-fold. And so he's constantly telling us that there are levels and levels and levels of listening to Jesus when he speaks. He uses another image. He says, it's like a fisherman who went out and he threw his net in the sea and he pulled in a whole shoal, and there was a whole bunch of little fish. And he was fairly satisfied initially with those. And then he found a big fish. And he took out the big fish, and he threw all the little guys back into the water, and he went home with the big fish. That's the person listening to Christ who has understood at the core what Jesus is talking about. He's not getting caught in fundamentalist kind of thinking. He's not getting caught in what the language appears to be suggesting, but he's going to the core of what Jesus is talking about. I want to use an example with you that I've used, I told you one time before. During my time in Kenya, for 14 years, I lived with the Kalenjin peoples. And there were people who did not live in big tribal groups. They didn't live in big villages. It was a polygamous society, and so what looked like a little village was just a single family. The father's house would be in the middle of the compound. And maybe he had 7 or 8 wives. Each of these wives would have her own house in a different part of the compound. And any one of the children who reached puberty, any of the boys who reached puberty, would build their own hut. So there might be 20 huts in a compound, but among the Kalenjin, that was not a village, it was a single family. And when a woman, one of the wives, became pregnant, 4 or 5 months into the pregnancy, sexual relationships with her husband would cease. And she would carry her baby, birth her child, and then wean it at about the age of 2.5 or so. And when the baby was weaned at about 2.5 or so, there was a ceremony in which the mother would give a bowl of soup to the little 2.5-year-old and say, go and give that to your daddy. And the little child would toddle across the compound with a bowl of soup to give it to his daddy. Now that was a deep, deep symbol for the Kalenjin people. For the little child, it felt like, wow, I'm all grown up, I'm a big boy now, I'm carrying soup to my daddy. That's how he understood it. The other siblings might have been jealous that, how come, he gets to carry soup to daddy and we don't get to carry soup to daddy. So that was their unpacking of this symbol. The little fella's unpacking it as, look at me, I'm a big boy. The other siblings are unpacking it in a jealous fashion. The mother and the father know exactly what the message here is. It's a message from the mother to the father that she is now prepared to re-engage with intimacies. And so the father and the mother understand it at a totally different level. They're unpacking this symbol at a totally different level. And if you were a cultural anthropologist watching this, you would take it to another level still. You would understand that this is part of a well-known system among the cultures of the world where we symbolically give messages to each other about intimacy and about relationships. So each one of them, the 4 of them, is going to unpack even a very, very subtle languaging in very, very different ways. And that's what I want to focus on today. I'm going to make 4 main points today. I want to say firstly what Jesus is not. And then secondly, Jesus, the avatar. Then thirdly, the tug of war between exoteric religion and esoteric religion. And fourthly, unless you become as little children, you will not even enter the kingdom of God. So those are the 4 points I'll make this morning. So firstly, what Jesus is not. All of last Sunday's homily I devoted to saying what I believed God was not. Today I want to focus on what Jesus is not. And here are some of the things that Jesus is not, as far as I'm concerned. Jesus is not a Jew. Jesus did not come either to promote Judaism or to reform Judaism. Jesus is very definitely not a Christian. Jesus did not come to start a brand new religion called Christianity, and he certainly did not come to be anti-Semitic. Jesus is an avatar, and I'll cover that in the second piece. And so these are two things that Jesus is not. But religions constantly want to claim figures as being their own. Avatars never identify with their spacesuits. Jesus is neither a Jew, and he certainly is not a Christian. So you look at the history of Judaism in its evolution in its own thinking. About 700 years before the coming of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the notion of the Messiah, the Mashiach, who was going to come, you find it in Isaiah's writing. And particularly after the exile in Babylon in the year 529 BC and afterwards, there's a big emphasis on this notion that there's a Messiah coming. But there are two very radically different notions in Judaism of what the Messiah is, who he will be. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 52 and 53 particularly, you have the notion that the Messiah, when he comes, is going to be a suffering servant. He will be a kind of a vicarious victim for everybody else, and his function will be to suffer for the rest of us. Side by side with that, there's a notion that no. The Mashiach, when he comes, he's going to be a politico-religious figure. He's going to be a kind of a theocrat. He will be both a political leader and a religious leader as well. And that becomes very, very strong in Judaism. And in fact, during one period when they're free, and Judaism was not free a lot from political overlords in its history, during one particular period, from 167 BC, after the Maccabean revolt, until 70 BC, when the Romans came in, there was a huge dispute in Judaism between two brothers, each of whom wanted to be both the king and the high priest. They wanted to have both kinds of power. And to settle the dispute between them, they invited the Romans in. And the Romans were very happy to come, and they stayed for the next 600 years. And so this notion of the Messiah is a very different notion in Judaism. Either it's the notion of a suffering servant, or it's the notion of a political religious figure. Christianity borrowed this and fell right into the same trap. And so we have the notion in Christianity that Jesus is this sinless victim whom a kind of a, what they call a sadistic father insisted on crucifying because he was so upset with the rest of us. And that Jesus is hanging on the cross as a sacrificial victim because God is really upset with the rest of us. So again, it's this vicarious victim syndrome. Christianity bought right into that. And the Jesus that's been promoted in Christianity is this suffering figure on a cross who died because God was really upset with the rest of us. The death of Jesus has nothing to do with the notion of sacrificial makeup for our sin. Nothing, zero, got to do with it. And we fall into the second trap as well, the very same trap that Judaism falls into, and that is we begin to promote Jesus and Jesus' teachings as a politico-religious figure. Jesus was neither a politician nor a religious reformer or a religious initiator. He was a mystic and he was an avatar, which is very, very different. But we keep forcing Jesus into these kinds of roles, which brings me to my second point. If this is who Jesus was not, then who was Jesus? And my belief was, and is, that Jesus is an avatar among some other great avatars. And the hallmarks of avatar are the following. An avatar is somebody who helps us to find portals, who helps us to jump dimensions, who helps us to shapeshift in our states of consciousness. That is the function of an avatar. It is both to teach ways of going there and to exemplify what it's like when we do get there. It is not the function of an avatar to teach religion or give people instruction in dogma. It's nothing to do with that. Secondly, the avatar very, very quickly, no matter what kind of a spacesuit she's born into, will quickly disidentify with gender, ethnicity, tribe, religion, socioeconomic status, all these things. Because part of the problem is for all of us, when we incarnate, we're faced with a whole bunch of limiting choices. We have to decide, am I going to be born male or female? Am I going to be born black or white? Am I going to be born Catholic or Jewish? Am I going to be born into a rich family or a poor family? Am I going to have a genius IQ or am I going to be retarded? Will I have an athletic body or will I be totally unable to move? We have to make all these limiting choices. And the problem is, we then misidentify and we think we are these things. We think we are our ethnic group, or we think we are our tribal affiliation, or we think we are our religious denomination, or we think we are our physical bodies, or we think we're our minds or our belief systems. And we're not any of these things. We're bite-sized pieces of God having an incarnational human experience. The avatar gets that very quickly, and therefore disidentifies very quickly with the tribe and the religion and the socioeconomic status into which he was born. That's the sign of the avatar. And a third sign of the avatar, it seems to me, is that the avatar is a way. And so Jesus would say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But you listen to it. The way is a signpost to get you to a destination. No avatar claims to be the destination. The avatar will always claim to be the way to the destination, but we insist on making them the destination. We put them on pedestals. We divinize them, having killed them first and eviscerated their teachings. Then we canonize them, or we even divinize them, and then we twist their teachings 180 degrees, so they're now supporting stuff, the very stuff that they challenged initially. And that's what we do with them. Avatars do not identify with their spacesuits. And they never claim to be the destination. They always claim to be way showers. They show us the way to God. And Jesus is such an avatar. This was Jesus' function. He came to show us the way to the Father, the way to full consciousness. And that is his function. Now, my next point then, I want to show what happens when this message is taken and just twisted out of all recognition. It's the journey from the tug-of-war between exoteric religion and esoteric religion. I want to look what happens, say, specifically within Christianity after Pentecost, when Jesus has died and has ascended to the Father, and the young church is born. What happens? For the main part, the leadership, which is all Jewish at this stage, is still totally identified with the Jewish religion. And so there'll be big problems when Gentiles become part of the flock. They will insist on making them Jews first. So we're still stuck in the esoteric. They did not get what Jesus was doing. Now, any avatar will proceed in a few different ways. The avatar will tell stories, not preach philosophy, or not talk theology, or not talk science. And on the basis, as he watches the listeners respond to the stories, he knows who's getting it at what level. And those who are getting it at a deeper level will be invited to some kind of an inner group, the 12 disciples or the 72 or whatever they are, because he knows these ones are ready now for the real message. And the real message is unity consciousness. And so the avatar is watching the audience really carefully as he tells his stories. Who's getting it merely at a fundamentalist level? Who's getting it at a dogmatic level? Who's getting it at a belief system level? And who's getting it at source, at core? Who really understands what's going on here? And in Jesus' life, almost nobody seemed to get it at source. His own family didn't get it. In Mark's Gospel, in chapter 3, in verse 20 and 21, after Jesus had been baptized by John, spent 40 days in the desert, finally ready for his mission, and he comes back and he begins to preach. We are told his family came to take him by force because they thought he was mad. Literally, they thought the guy had flipped out. And so they came to grab him and take him by force. His family didn't get it when he began to speak who he was. His disciples thought it was a meal ticket to fame. The Romans saw him as a political threat. The Sadducees and the Pharisees saw him as a religious threat. Very few people got who Jesus was in his lifetime. Maybe his mother finally did. Mary of Magdala certainly did. Maybe John, the beloved disciple, got it. But most of the others, they really didn't get it. But even after Pentecost, they still didn't seem to get it. They're still stuck in the legalism of Judaism and the exoterical form, the organizational form of being Jewish. Now, the Catholic Church didn't do any better. Because the Catholic Church got a group of it, they did the very same thing. They're now identifying Jesus with institutionalism. And when you look at the history of the Catholic Church in particular, in the year 313, it becomes the state religion of Rome. Now, the organization which was founded around the esoteric teaching of Jesus is totally an exoteric organization, interested in political, economic, and even military power. And you watch our progress over the subsequent 1700 years, and that's been our journey. So 313, we become the state religion of Rome. Now we're identified with the power system. with the economic models, with the political systems, with the military models, and with the particular form of religion. We set about very, very quickly destroying pagan religions and Mithraism in particular. By 1054, there's the first huge split in Christianity when the Eastern Church and the Western Church anathematize each other and excommunicate each other. Very shortly after, within 40 years, the First Crusade, 1099. We will march across Europe, firstly making victims of Eastern Orthodox Christians, slaughtering them, then getting to the land of Israel, slaughtering the infidels, the Muslims we found, and the Jews there, all the while wearing the cross of Christ on our jerseys. So the first sight they get of us, and the last sight they get of us, is the cross of Jesus as they lie dying on the ground. That was our gift to them. In 1492, we turned on ourselves, and now we start inquisitions, and we start witch hunts, and we start killing people within the organization because we're heretics or heterodoxical or whatever. By 1517, there's the second great crack in the edifice, and there's the Protestant churches and the Catholic churches, and there will be a famous phrase in Latin used, cuius regio eius et religio. Whoever rules the region determines the religion. It was a pun in Latin as it is in English. Cuius regio eius et religio. Whoever owns the region decides the religion. So whoever the prince was, if he became Protestant, everybody had to become Protestant in his region. If he remained Catholic, everybody had to remain Catholic. Now we've severed it right down the middle. By 1871, the Papal States had shrunken to nothing. The temporal power of the papacy was gone, so to compensate himself from the fact that he no longer had secular authority, Pope Pius XI made himself infallible. We've gone a long way down that path. And now you look at, if I were to look at the spectrum of Christianity today, all the ways from fundamentalism to conservatism, to the moderates, to the liberals, across to the mystics. None of us still get it, except the mystics. The fundamentalists are totally convinced that Jesus spoke literally, and that we have to understand his teaching literally. The conservatives and even the moderates are still aligning Jesus' message with the status quo. They're shoring up, they continue to shore up the status quo, no matter how corrupt the status quo becomes. And we find this, for instance, it's shoring up our economic models, it's shoring up our political systems, it's shoring up our military movements. And so our dollar bill says, in God we trust. Are we really trusting in God? Are we trusting in an economic model which is brutalizing a lot of our own citizens and many people outside our country? Are we shoring up the military model? I was shocked when I came to this country 23 years ago to find out that there's a huge battle cruiser in the American Navy which is called Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. A warship called the body of Christ. It was shocking to me. It was shocking to me to realize that we dropped our first atomic bomb on August the 6th in 1945. August the 6th is the feast of the Transfiguration of Jesus. And this was our gift to the people of Japan. This was some transfiguration. And so we are using, the conservatives and the moderates, not just the fundamentalists, are using the institutionalized, organized religion, the exoteric form of Jesus' teaching to shore up all kinds of corrupt regimes. The slide continues. So where do we break out of this model? Which is my fourth point. Unless we become like little children. It is not all bad news, it is great news. The mystics have survived right throughout exoteric Christianity. The esoteric wing has always survived. The Francis of Assisi, the Meister Eckharts, the Hildegard von Bingen, the Teresa of Avila's, the John of the Crosses. These have survived throughout Christian history, and they've kept alive, they've fanned alive the mystical, esoteric core of Jesus' message, which is what he came to do. He was not a political reformer. The liberals, make another mistake. While they're not using Jesus' teaching to shore up corrupt regimes, they're still stripping Jesus of his mystical message and reducing him merely to a kind of a social activist. Jesus is not a social activist. Jesus is an avatar who comes to bring unity consciousness. And when somebody steps into unity consciousness, they're immediately filled with compassion for the human condition and for the condition of animals and the condition of our planet. And so, of course, they're going to become socially active. But they're not social activists. That is not their raison d'être. They did not come to be social activists. They came to be avatars to create a unity consciousness which will inevitably lead to the compassion that leads to social action. But the liberals just reduce Jesus. They strip him completely of mystery and reduce him just to being a kind of a liberal like themselves involved in social justice, for all the importance of that. So what do we learn here? We learn that there are many ways back into the mystery, back into what Jesus really came about to do. Spending time in nature is perhaps one of the best. When you're surrounded by nature, it is very difficult not to become mystical. If you do meditation as a regular basis, it's an assistance towards getting to that place. If you work with your dreams, it's allowing you to shift your state of consciousness at will. If you use your imagination, and I've said to you before that I do not believe that imagination is the faculty that allows us to make up stuff which isn't real. That is not imagination. Imagination is the faculty that allows us to download from different dimensions what's even more real and to translate it into the language of the densest kind of reality. So where do we learn that best? We learn it from children. And so when Jesus says, unless you become like little children, you will not even enter. You won't even get to first base. Now, what do kids have that the rest of us have lost? Firstly, they ask extraordinary amounts of questions, mostly why questions. They're not so much interested in the mechanics of how stuff works, but they want to know why things are. Secondly, they're filled with an awe and a curiosity about life. Thirdly, they're extraordinarily forgiving. All these things. But the most important quality of children, in my opinion, and the one that Christ was mostly alluding to when he said, unless you become like little children, you won't even enter or recognize or see the kingdom of God, was children's ability to discover the portals, to discover the holes in the fabric of dense reality that allows them to move through into altered states of consciousness. They're shapeshifters by nature. They're dimension jumpers by nature. They're portal recognizers by nature. That is the great quality of children until we begin to purge them from it. We begin to tell them that it's not real, it's only imagination. And so the child begins to lose the flexibility. Over even their physical flexibility changes. And so at some stage, the child who was able to put his big toe in his mouth now instead is taught simply to put his foot there. And we do that emotionally, and we do that mentally, and we do it spiritually. Children are our greatest teachers because they teach us how to shapeshift states of consciousness. They teach us how to find the portals and how to look for the portals, and they teach us how to jump dimensions into the other levels of reality, the less dense levels, which are the most real levels. So to end my homily today, I want to share with you a piece that, an event that happened to me in December of last year. It was December the 16th, 2008. And for me it's just a kind of elucidation of the fact that it's all around us. We don't have to do a whole lot in order to find where the portals are, how to jump dimensions, and how to shapeshift. This happened to me when I was actually inside in bed on the 16th of December 2008. And I wrote it down as following. I call it Birthscape. At 950 feet elevation, my house is below the snow line, but above the frost line and above the hailstones line. Yesterday in Windsor, I made the mistake of leaving the rear windows of my car slightly ajar so that my dog Kayla could breathe easily while I dashed into Office Depot. As soon as my back was turned, a passing grey-black cloud dumped a couple of tons of icy hailstones on the parking lot. Kayla jumped into the front seat to avoid the onslaught, which had found the ideal angle to penetrate the window gap. And as I was going to bed last night, a white covering of frost was sprinkled liberally on the ground and on my rooftop. It looked like a rehearsal for Santa's arrival. I woke this morning to the drumming of its melting. The tempo varied from an urgent rat-tat-tat-tat-tat to a more leisurely plish, plish, plish. From the icy roof, it melted into the gutters, and it made its way down the downspout just outside my bedroom door, where it dropped vertically and rhythmically. Nature will use anything, even human artifacts, in the service of its music making. So here I was, awakened by a serenading gutter. I raised myself onto my elbows and looked out through the curved, curtainless window. Across the valley, Bald Mountain was silently shoving its hairless head through the fog bank, like a great sea monster breaking the placid surface of the ocean to study the overwater world. A 3-week-old moon was suspended above the scene as if trying to make up its mind, carefully pondering possible lunar landing sites on the Leviathan's shoulder. The infant sun occasionally managed to pierce the fluffy cloud and spotlight the creature's face, a face in which wet tree clusters glistened like the scales. It was the meeting of Ichthus and Helios. Then the fog bank began to ascend under some great thermal updraft, and the sea monster, equally silently, submerged his great head and disappeared once more. I could imagine a huge tail thumping as the turbine of his life force drove him powerfully into the netherworld. The fog bank continued to rise, and now my window, my house, and myself were all embedded in a world of white. Visibility was down to mere feet, opening even further the eyes of my soul. It was a seamless transition between dimensions into the deepest reality of all. Safe in God's womb, I realized that the pitter-patter of the melting frost was the coordinated beating of 1,000,000 hearts excited by the prospect of imminent incarnation.